Welcome to Markets Plus. I'm Eduardo Tobón, head of the Economic Advisory Group and Latino segment at BMO Commercial Bank. I'm honored to introduce our next episode, stemming from the Latino Leaders Index 500, powered by BMO. In this episode, you'll hear my recent conversation with Julieta LaMalfa, Chief Financial Officer of Canela Media, and Ricardo Mendez, Chief Financial Officer of KUA, as we discuss corporate governance, impacts of AI, and practical recommendations for fellow entrepreneurs and CFOs. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out a few of our other episodes on this topic. Now to the episode.
Welcome to Markets Plus, where leading experts from across BMO discuss factors shaping the markets, economy, industry sectors, and much more. Visit bmocm.com/Markets Plus for more episodes.
I get the privilege of having two friends here on stage, folks that I've known in some cases for very many years, in the case of Julieta, Ricardo now for a little bit over a year. And I will tell a few things about them here before we start our question and answers with them. Julieta LaMalfa has been with Canela Media in their rapid hypergrowth that they've experienced. Canela is a company that's now reached $72 million in annual revenues. It was a startup. And she's helped the company obviously grow, and you can take a look at, what that means. But that's a company of very decent size, and we're going to learn from her as a CFO tonight and the challenges and opportunities and things that she's been through as a result of that. Ricardo here is with a company, KUA, American KUA. And KUA, if you read the definition by the company of what KUA means, is holistically feed the body and the spirit, which I thought it was a very, very interesting aspect of the company. It's currently ranked number 79. It moved up from number 94. It's a $300 million company. It's private equity backed. And Ricardo has secured over $100 million from banks, and we'll learn more about that, and from private equity funds, and has guided the company through 14 acquisitions. So the people that you have here on stage have been through a lot of different things in their journey, and it's a real privilege for us to have them with us. The first question I have for them, and I'm going to start here with Julieta, is could you share what challenges you've lived through as a CFO and also as a business executive that have served as an important lesson for you in your life?
So first of all, thank you for hosting BMO, and thank you everybody who showed up here today. I think that there's always like power to the network. So I appreciate the time that everyone took. In terms of my challenges, I was the first executive that joined Canela. So I joined at a time when they had just finished raising the Series A round. And to me, well, actually, we were still in the tail end of raising the round. And I say that because at that point, we had also the privilege and the foresight to see how much more additional capital we would need. And that's when we actually partnered with BMO. So I can share more about that later. But the challenge at that point, right, and there's been many challenges throughout the journey, but the challenge at that point was, really feeling like we had a lot of capital, but at the same time balancing that with the fact that we had a lot of goals, and that me knowing, right, that nothing lasts forever. So at that point, like really trying to be strategic about all of our capital investments and like laying out what our runway was going to be, and more importantly, what those milestones within that runway had to be so that we continue growing when the time came to raise more equity. So that's one piece. The other piece that was challenging for me specifically was the international expansion. And by that, we opened an office in Mexico where most of our employees now reside. We at some point opened up Colombia and then had to shut down that operation. So the international expansion was interesting and held its own challenges. But personally, I think throughout all of that, I would always go back to some of my core values, which to me is equity and commitment, right? And so, and I believe that Canela has and will continue to build something that will continue elevating the profile of the Latino community. And that's something that always kept me going throughout those challenging moments.
Thank you for that, Ricardo.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be here. This is my second year. We started this relationship 1 year ago, exactly. I always like to start saying that everything started with a dream, right? My boss and I wanted to do something different, something that in those times did not exist. It might sound trivial, easy now to have a platform of food and beverage companies. And there might be some examples now, but in those times there were not. So we came from the food industry and we knew finance. So we came with this crazy idea, right? So the next step, then what? It's a beautiful dream, but you need money, right? You need prospects to acquire, because our thesis was based on acquiring companies. I was born and raised in Mexico, so we started this business in Mexico City, acquiring very small companies there, but with potential. We were dreamers. We are still dreamers. We like to believe in things. So we had maybe 1,000 meetings with private equity investors, with VCs, with banks, with tons of guys, right? With tons of guys that everybody was saying, no, 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 there's nothing here, But suddenly the sparkles appears and we secured $80 million in funding. So we were very happy, of course, but then what? How do you use that money? Which acquisitions are you going to make? At the same time, we were exploring, many companies. Not all of them made a good fit with us strategically or from a partnership standpoint. And coming to your question, one of the first challenges I faced was which one to pick, right? Other executives were pushing for some acquisitions that they wanted to, but as a CFO, you have to be very, to have your mind very cold and to think thoroughly on what to do. Then when you're growing too, you have, as a CFO, to make very tough decisions. If a business is not performing well or an executive is not delivering, you have to raise your hand and fire people or to shut down a division or a business. I know it's tough and there might be some capital invested, but you have to do it at some point.
That's a great start. And perhaps this sort of follow up to that for both of you, I'll start with you, Ricardo, is maybe the critical aspects that your company or your industry has dealt with in the U.S. market. You were talking about obviously doing business in Mexico. Now you're doing business here in the U.S. What have you seen that has helped with the company's journey in that regard?
Sure. We moved into the U.S. in 2021, right? We transformed our company from a Mexican corporation into an LLC, incorporated in Delaware, because in those times, 75% of our revenues came from the U.S. The U.S. market is huge. So for us, it was amazing how everything grew and everything was easier. As compared with Mexican operations. However, we were facing an important challenge of growth. The good thing here is the company was growing so quickly that we needed capital to continue investing, in production lines or in warehouses or distribution. However, our free cash flow, our internal free cash flow was not enough. So, this happened 1 year ago when the Latino Index ceremony happened. I didn't work with BMO. I have to make that caveat, right? And someone approached me. Well, specifically both approached me. And he asked me, who are you working with, right? At BMO. Well, no one. I'm just here for recognition. And we have to fix that, he said. 1 week later, we were meeting. We were discussing potential opportunities for our company. Something that I have to say very clearly here is that you guys understood perfectly our needs and our vision for the company. So I don't have words to say thanks, but because you trusted in our company. So we secured that funding that was necessary for continued growing the company. And now we are about to launch a new production line in Wisconsin, in our factory in Wisconsin, that will double our capacity. It will reduce scrap significantly. It will reduce the need for labor as well. Labor is tough in the country, right? And it will make us much more efficient with higher quality products. So we'll be able to reach new clients that we didn't have the opportunity before with our previous technology. So with this new technology, we'll be able to do that. And I want to thank you guys for this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to take you on a roadshow. This is the kind of praise that we want to hear about our bank and the way we partner, because it's all about the solutions. And it takes two to start with the CFO and the banker. And I'm very glad to hear that worked out. But to your point, you were sitting here in the audience and coming, with your CEO to receive an award. And here you are sitting on a panel talking about what has transpired, and we are very pleased to have you as a client. So thank you very much for those experiences and for sharing with this group. Julieta, you also have stories to say and something to share as it relates to a venture-backed company and what you've been through.
Yeah, and there's clearly a theme here, right? It's capital. And so going back to the beginnings of Canela, and I think there's like a lot of people in this room to thank as well, but I don't know all stats in the world, but what I do know is that Latinos get something around 2% of venture-backed funds, right? So Latinos benefit 2% out of that. Latinas, 0.4%. And I mentioned that because when we think about like how critical the path was for Canela, Canela wouldn't have existed if enough people didn't commit to it. So Isabel Rafferty, who's the founder, will share publicly that she was rejected by something like 200 VC firms before Angeles investors really kind of took Canela, helped with the equity story, and was then able to secure financing. So they went through a seed round. I wasn't there for that. That was a $3 million seed round. And then fast forward, the company is growing significantly. The company's above 20 million in revenue at this point. They go through the Series A, and the folks that are sitting in our cap table today are primarily impact investors. And I say that because still, even then, when she was able to secure funding, it came from those investors who their rules for returns just deferred a bit, right? And at that point, and I joined the company at Q4 of 21 is when I joined. The round was closed at the beginning of January. And at that point, we're looking at what the projects and the goals are for the next 2 years and trying to build the runway. And then we get to a moment where, Isabel asked me, how much money do I need? And I gave her a number. We backed into how much debt we could secure based off of our projections. And that's when we really found BMO as well. And that's when we partnered, right? And at that point, I also want to mention, it was part of their Empower program. So, they came out with a $5 billion initiative to help Black and brown businesses. And this was one of the initiatives that they did to provide capital to companies like ours. And I'll tell you that I went to other banks at that point as well. And this was a lot more competitive and flexible, and allowed the folks who were at the cap table not to get further diluted. So there's just so many elements to that story. And I always say, and I'm now an investor, right? Not only through Angeles Investors, but some other venture funds. And for me, I put a lot of my own personal capital into Latino businesses because I've seen what it can do and how it can impact the lives of many.
Thank you for sharing that. Stories are beautiful, and you can see the passion, you can see the intellect that it takes to craft the strategies as CFOs of what the companies need and the journey that they go through. And I want this audience for them to receive some practical recommendations from both Julieta and Ricardo. So Julieta, what would you recommend to other fellow CFOs or business owners or entrepreneurs, given the current stage of your company and what you've learned from this when it comes to venture capital or private equity, or just in general, some practical recommendations?
In terms of what I would tell CFOs or founders is to continuously revisit their equity story. And by continuously, I mean every other month or so, look at the equity story, because I really believe that it holds you accountable for the business decisions that you're making and executing. You talked about executives and business lines that maybe weren't performing. I really think that if you revisited your equity story, you would go back and say, like, this is where I am now. How do I explain that to an investor in 2 months, right? In 2 months, how am I building credibility by either sticking to my guns or not? And sometimes you have to, and granted, I'm here as the CFO and not the CEO, right? And I think that there's different roles to play. I see the CEO a bit more visionary than my role, for example. Like, I'm a natural worrier. So I'm always like, are we sure? Are we sure? And like running all kinds of scenarios, while at the same time making sure that, she feels comfortable in taking the swings that she's taking, because I really believe that's what creates, successful ventures, right? You have to take risks. But you also, if you want to scale, often have to rely on investors, and investors want credible stories, and they want to see that whatever you're putting out, you're either measuring it correctly, and if you're making mistakes, that you're learning from them. So to me, that's part of the equity story and the journey, and you start mapping it out. And even if you have a setback, if you can show how you learned and how you pivoted, I think that's going to serve you well.
Very helpful. Ricardo, in your case, you are private equity backed, but if you can respond that question too from your perspective for other fellow CFOs.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's easier to say than to do, right? The first thing is choose carefully your partners. Even when you feel that you need that money urgently, right? A partnership is like a marriage. If you don't have a fit with your investor, things will not work well. We're fortunate, but I have friends with similar, ventures that have failed because of that, right? So it's very important. And second, invest on the corporate governance of your company. It pays a lot. Corporate governance mean audited financials, right? On-time tax returns, audit committees, board meetings. It sounds trivial, but it is not. So those might be my two main recommendations.
Yeah, if I can just add to, because to me, like that again, that's so important, right? And I 100% agree with you. And it becomes part of your equity story, because one of the slides in your equity story is like, who are your partners, right? Because your partners also have a brand and credibility in the marketplace, and whoever that next round is going to look at that. So once you kind of have that framework, I think there's so many ways that it starts kind of paying dividends.
So glad that both of you really hone in on that. I think from a corporate governance perspective, and specifically the board directors that you have, there is a lot of talent, because the board needs to be fully based on meritocracy. You need the people that are going to help your company for the industry you're in, for the challenges that you have. But the reality is a lot of our Hispanic, Latino leaders, CEOs, CFOs, and other folks are equipped to be able to help boards. And I see a lot of these companies starting to take advantage of that, both in the private markets as well as in the public markets. It's still a journey. It's still going to increase over time, but it's starting to happen. And when companies start paying attention to precisely that corporate governance, it's a very much a positive effect that keeps happening, and more leaders benefit from it, and the companies as well. If I may switch gears very quickly to artificial intelligence and innovation. We keep hearing about generative AI all the time. And perhaps I start with you, Julieta. What impact do you feel that AI or generative AI could have in your role as CFO, or your role as an executive, and in your business or the businesses that you may be involved with?
So I'll share a story. We were contemplating an acquisition, and I went to just ChatGPT. And I was like, so if, here's who we are, nothing confidential, of course. I was like, but here's where we are. And we're looking at a business that does X, Y, and Z. And I fed it some inputs, and I said, can you create a model for me? And it did. And then it asked me if I wanted to also include, X, Y, and Z variable. And I was like, oh, well, I would have thought about that eventually, right? But yes, please do. And then I got, it was kind of scary because I was like, oh my gosh, this is like amazing. And then I asked it to make it dynamic and gave it to me in Excel, and then it did. And all the formulas were crazy and everything was screwed up. And I was like, thank God, because I still have a job. But it's really powerful, like, right? Like what it's doing and where it's going. As you know, and you hear this a lot, like you have to engage with them as partners and as someone who you would run things by, not necessarily like own anything that you're doing today. So that's one way. Of course, like in the tools and the processes, writing audit memos, like I'm leveraging it as much as I can, creating dashboards. Whenever we're looking at companies, I'm like, what kind of business model could they have? What could their monetization model be like? So just research as well.
Thank you for sharing that. That's terrific. How can we, and I would say the collective we and the both of you and everyone else, support each other as Latino leaders to rise the tide for all?
Well, there's just so many, there's like no one right answer, right? I think that, at the end of the day is like acknowledging that we need each other. And so, I was also born in Mexico. I was brought here when I was young and was raised in the south side of Chicago, and just credit civic leaders and mentors for where I am today. And there were a lot of people in my journey that have touched me in a way, that inspire me. And I want to be that for other people. So earlier in my professional career, I did a lot in, tutoring and mentoring and joining boards in education, because that's one of my passion points. And then I met Adela Cepeda, who was like, okay, so I have Angeles investors. And I thought, at that point in my life anyway, I was at a point where economically I could also contribute to entrepreneurs. And I thought, why not? And that led me to a path of meeting Canela, because it was at an Angeles Investors networking event that I first learned of Canela. At the networking event, I was told they were looking for a CFO. And I was like, that's not what I do. But here I am today, right? And even throughout that path, I've been able to engage with a lot of business leaders that have offered their advice, expertise, time, networks. And so I just encourage everyone to be that for each other. And, I think that giving back is something that's only sustainable if you're doing it in a way that means something to you. So whether that's housing, healthcare, like whatever it is that, Latinos need help in every way, shape, and form. It's just because we're human, and all humans need that as well.
Well, you cover everything, I guess, right? What I may add is, let's talk and get together, right? And if you're invited to any event, go, right? Attend meetings, chambers of commerce. I think that's the best way to have more presence and to grow.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Julieta.
Thanks for listening. You can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. For more episodes, visit bmocm.com/marketsplus.
The views expressed here are those of the participants and may not necessarily represent those of BMO Capital Markets, its affiliates, or subsidiaries. For BMO disclosures, please visit bmocm.com/podcast/disclaimer.